I hadn't wanted to go out that night. The streets were icy, the kind that makes every step feel like a gamble, and the cold was the sort that seeped through your coat no matter how thick it was. But it was my best friend's birthday, and I didn't want to be the one who let her down. By the end of the night, I was glad to leave the noise and the sticky floors of the club behind. The rideshare app said my driver was 3 minutes away, and when a red car pulled up with a man in a Santa suit behind the wheel, I didn't think twice. It was their holiday promotion. Drivers dressed as Santa to spread a bit of cheer. I'd seen loads of them around the city. The driver didn't say much when I got in, just nodded and tapped his phone. The car smelled faintly of peppermint, and the faint sound of some Christmas jingle played on the radio. I slumped back in the seat, exhausted, and stared out at the frost-covered streets slipping by. At first, nothing seemed off. The app showed the route to my flat, the little blue line leading us through the city. But after a few minutes, I noticed the streets outside didn't look familiar. I glanced at my phone. The map had frozen. The driver didn't seem bothered, his gloved hands gripping the wheel tightly as we turned onto a quieter road. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was avoiding traffic or following a quicker route. But when the car turned again onto a street even darker and emptier than the last, my stomach started to churn. I asked him about the route, but he didn't even flinch, just kept driving. The app refreshed suddenly, and the blue line reappeared. But it didn't lead to my flat anymore. The destination had changed, a different address, somewhere I didn't recognize. My heart started racing as I stared at the map, willing it to make sense. The streets grew narrower, lined with rows of silent houses, their windows dark. The only light came from the car's headlights, which carved a path through the night like a tunnel. I could feel my palms sweating, the air inside the car suddenly stifling. The man in the Santa suit didn't look at me once. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his face blank. I tried to stay calm, to think of what to do. My mind raced through possibilities. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. The child lock. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at him, trying to figure out if he noticed, if he knew I'd realized something was wrong. The car slowed as we approached a junction. I spotted a small streetlight ahead, its yellow glow cutting through the dark. Without thinking, I reached for my bag, fumbling with the zip, and grabbed the first thing I could, a half-empty bottle of perfume. My hands shook as I twisted the cap off, ready to do something, anything if he tried to stop me. The car stopped briefly, waiting for a break in traffic. I saw my chance. I leaned forward, trying to sound calm as I asked him to let me out. He didn't respond, his knuckles tightening around the wheel. The car lurched forward again, and I felt the panic bubbling over. I didn't wait. As the car started to pick up speed, I aimed the bottle and sprayed wildly. The sharp chemical scent filled the car, and the driver let out a low, guttural sound. His hands jerked on the wheel, and the car swerved, skidding slightly on the icy road. I didn't think. I grabbed the lock on my side, yanking at it until it finally clicked open. The door swung out, the cold air rushing in. I launched myself out of the car, hitting the frozen pavement hard, my breath knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, slipping and stumbling, not daring to look back. The car screeched to a halt behind me, but I didn't stop. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. But the thought of him catching up kept me moving. When I finally reached a main road, the lights of a petrol station flickering in the distance, I stopped. My chest heaved as I turned back, expecting to see the red car creeping after me, but the street was empty, the silence ringing in my ears. I stood there, shivering, my breath fogging in the air. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen was blank. No service. The cabin wasn't much, but it was enough. The windows were boarded up, and the snow piling against the walls made it look half buried. It wasn't like anyone else would be coming here, not this far off the main road. That's what I'd told myself anyway. I'd been on the run for 3 days, and every breath felt like borrowed time. The Santa suit was a last-minute choice, pinched off a washing line behind some poky little house. It didn't fit well. The trousers were tight, and the jacket reeked of damp, but it was enough to throw people off. No one suspects Santa, not at Christmas. I just got the fire going when I heard them. Voices, faint but growing louder, carried on the wind. I froze, crouched by the hearth, listening. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then came the crunch of boots on snow. 3, maybe 4 of them, too close already. The door rattled, and I had no choice but to open it. They were a sorry lot, faces red from the cold, clothes soaked through, backpacks sagging with weight. One of them, a woman, looked ready to collapse. They saw the suit and hesitated, but desperation won out. They begged shelter with their eyes, and I couldn't say no without raising suspicion. I stepped aside and let them in. The cabin felt smaller with them in it. They crowded around the fire, stamping their feet and rubbing their hands, their chatter filling the room. I kept to the shadows, watching, waiting for a chance to figure out what to do. One of them, a bloke with a scruffy beard, looked me over, his gaze lingering a little too long. I pretended to fuss with the firewood, avoiding his eyes. They asked questions. Where had I come from? How long had I been here? I gave short answers. Vague ones, said I'd been passing through, got caught in the storm. They didn't seem to notice the lack of gear, the empty rucksack in the corner. Or maybe they were just too cold to care. The hours dragged. They unpacked tins of food, shared them out, offered me some. I accepted, trying to seem harmless, normal. But the whole time I was thinking about what would happen if they found out who I was. My face had been on the news, plastered across papers. Even with the beard and the suit, it was only a matter of time before one of them recognized me. I decided to make them uneasy first. It wasn't hard. The storm howled outside, rattling the walls, and the fire cast long, flickering shadows. I told them I'd heard strange noises earlier out in the woods. Footsteps. Maybe an animal, maybe not. Their laughter was forced, their eyes darting to the boarded windows. Later, when they were huddled in their sleeping bags, I crept to the door and scratched lightly at the wood, just enough to wake them. And I heard them stir, whispering, asking each other if they'd heard it too. I stayed silent, letting their fear grow. By the second night, they were on edge. They argued over little things, who got the warmest spot by the fire, who'd eaten more of the food. I fanned the flames when I could, dropping hints that someone had moved my rucksack or shifted the firewood while I wasn't looking. It worked. They started eyeing each other with suspicion, voices rising. That night, the scruffy one disappeared. He'd gone outside to relieve himself and hadn't come back. The others panicked, but I kept my face blank, my voice calm. I suggested he might have wandered off, gotten lost in the storm. Privately, I wondered if he'd recognized me, after all, and had run off to get help. The storm didn't let up. By the third night, it was just me and the two women left. One of them hadn't stopped crying since the bloke vanished. The other kept pacing, glancing at the door, muttering that she'd heard something outside. I stayed by the fire, silent, watching. In the early hours, I heard it too. A faint knocking, coming from somewhere beyond the wall. I knew it couldn't be the wind. I set out early, the crisp mountain air biting at my face as I tightened my scarf. The villagers had muttered their usual superstitions the night before, warning me about Krampusnacht and what happens to those who venture into the mountains. I'd heard it all before, every winter since I started hunting these woods. Stories meant to scare children, I thought. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, my boots sturdy against the frozen ground. I wasn't one to scare easily. The forest was silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath my feet. Thick pines rose around me, their branches heavy with frost, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted as the weak sunlight struggled through the canopy. The cold made everything sharper. The creak of a tree, the snap of a distant twig. I liked the quiet. It made the hunt feel pure, like I was part of something ancient. By midday, I'd tracked a pair of deer prints through the snow. They were fresh, leading deeper into the woods where the trees grew thicker, the shadows darker. I followed them without hesitation, feeling the thrill of the chase. My fingers itched for the weight of my rifle, the sharp crack of a shot echoing through the forest. The first time I heard the bells, I barely noticed them. A faint jingle, distant and soft, carried on the wind. I assumed it was my mind playing tricks, maybe a sleigh bell from one of the villages below. But the sound came again as I crouched by the tracks, this time closer, clearer. I paused, my breath misting in the air. The forest was still, too still, no rustle of animals, no bird song, just the faint chime of bells, swaying gently in a rhythm that didn't match the wind. I scanned the trees, my pulse quickening. Nothing moved. The tracks led me to a clearing, the snow untouched except for the deer prints. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing, as if the animal had vanished mid-stride. I circled the spot, searching for any sign of what might have happened. No blood, no struggle, just nothing. The bells rang again, louder now somewhere behind me. I spun, gripping my rifle, but there was no one there, just the trees, tall and silent, their branches creaking in the cold. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step back, my boots crunching in the snow. It was then I noticed the other tracks, not deer hooves, large, deep impressions in the snow leading from the far side of the clearing and stopping just short of where I stood. They hadn't been there a moment ago. The bells rang out again, impossibly close. I turned sharply, scanning the trees, my rifle trembling in my hands. There was something there, just beyond the edge of my vision. A shape, tall and hunched, its shadow stretching unnaturally between the trees. My breath caught as the figure moved, slow and deliberate, stepping into the faint light of the clearing. Its silhouette was wrong, inhuman, broad shoulders hunched beneath a ragged coat of fur, long limbs ending in clawed hands, and the face hidden beneath a twisted mask of horns and hollow eyes. Bells dangled from its body, swaying softly as it moved, the sound almost mocking. I didn't think. I raised the rifle, aimed and fired. The shot rang out, shattering the silence. The figure didn't flinch. It stood there, unmoving, as the echo faded into the trees. My hands shook as I fumbled to reload, but before I could raise the rifle again, the bells chimed once more, louder now, deafening. It was moving faster than I thought possible, its shadow darting between the trees. My instincts kicked in and I ran. The snow was deep, slowing me down, each step dragging like I was wading through quicksand. The bells followed, always just behind me, never fading. I tripped and fell, the cold biting through my clothes as I hit the ground. My rifle skidded out of reach, lost in the snow. I scrambled to my feet, but the forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in, their branches like twisted arms reaching for me. The bells stopped. I stood there, gasping, the silence pressing down on me. The clearing stretched empty ahead, but I didn't dare move. My breath clouded the air as I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark woods. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to explain why the bells had stopped. And then I saw them. Hoofprints circling me in the snow, large, deep. It started as a simple idea, a bit of fun to make some extra cash over the holidays. I signed up as a rideshare driver, decorated the car with some fairy lights and bought a cheap Santa costume. I even advertised free rides in the app. People loved the gimmick, and the tips weren't bad either. It was harmless, festive fun. The evening rush had been busy. Couples heading to dinners, friends off to the pub, last-minute shoppers dashing home with bags full of gifts. The snow had started falling softly, enough to make the streets glisten without turning them treacherous. The bookings kept coming in, and I kept accepting them. It wasn't until around 9 that things started to go wrong. The first sign was the app. I'd accepted a request from a woman at a retail park, but when I got there, no one was waiting. I circled the lot twice before the app updated, replacing her details with a new pickup a few streets over. Annoying, but not unusual. The next passenger was a man in his 30s, arms loaded with wrapped parcels. He seemed distracted, barely glanced at me as he climbed in and muttered the address. It wasn't far, a quiet residential street, according to the app. I confirmed it and set off. At first he didn't notice the sat-nav had recalculated the route a couple of times, but I put it down to traffic. He was busy scrolling on his phone, so I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we turned onto a narrow, unlit lane that he spoke up, sounding uneasy. I checked the screen. It still showed the same destination just a few miles ahead. I tried to reassure him, but something felt wrong. The lane was barely wide enough for one car, bordered by tall hedges that blocked the view on either side. The snow was falling heavier now, thick and fast, making it harder to see. The only sound was the crunch of tires on frozen ground and the rhythmic thunk of the windscreen wipers. The signal on my phone dropped, the map freezing mid-turn. I slowed down, glancing at the man in the rearview mirror. He'd put his phone down and was watching the road ahead, his shoulders tense. I looked back at the sat-nav, but it was useless. I had no idea where we were. The lane curved sharply, and then the trees closed in, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. My headlights caught something up ahead, a break in the hedge, a gate. Beyond it, a faint light flickered. I pulled over, unsure of what else to do. The man shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. I gestured at the app, but he didn't seem to care anymore. The light beyond the gate glowed faintly, like a beacon, drawing the eye. I don't know why I got out. Maybe I thought I'd find a house, someone with directions or at least a better signal. The air was freezing, my breath clouding in front of me as I approached the gate. The light flickered again and I realized it wasn't a porch light, it was moving. A torch swinging back and forth as if someone was walking. The man called out from the car, his voice sharp, but I barely heard him. The torchlight stopped moving. For a moment, everything was still. Then it turned towards me. I backed away, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to the car. The man was already out, staring past me at the gate, his face pale. Without a word, he climbed back into the passenger seat, and I didn't argue. I slammed the door and reversed down the lane as fast as I could. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. When I finally dropped him off somewhere far from his original destination, he practically ran from the car. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel, trying to calm my breathing. The app pinged. A new ride request, another passenger waiting. I hit accept. We had been planning this trip for months, a weekend getaway to the mountains. The forest was covered in a thick blanket of snow, the kind that made everything feel soft and quiet, muffling sounds as we trudged through it. It was beautiful. Too beautiful, really. It made everything feel safe, like nothing could go wrong out here. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. The locals always warned us about venturing into the woods around this time of year, talking about some creature called Krampus. They said it would come for anyone who was naughty, especially during the winter. I laughed it off. Local legends. They always had some strange story to keep people in line. We were just there to camp, nothing more. The first night was peaceful. We set up the tents, started a fire, and settled in with beers and jokes. The cold was biting, but we had enough layers on to stay warm. It wasn't until the wind picked up around midnight that things started to feel a bit off. The trees swayed more violently than they should have, groaning under the pressure, and the fire seemed to burn lower than it should have. We heard a low growl then, coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. It was deep and guttural, almost like a warning, but no one said anything. We all laughed it off too, one of the guys probably making it up to spook us. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just the growl. It was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, creeping closer to the edge of the campfire. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something out there just out of sight. The next morning we woke to find something strange. Claw marks on the trees, long, deep gouges that must have been at least 6 feet off the ground. There were several of them scattered around the campsite, as if whatever made them had been watching us overnight. I tried to dismiss it, maybe a bear or some other animal. But bears didn't leave marks like that. The claws were too sharp, too deliberate. We decided to stay for another night. We weren't going to let some scratched up trees ruin the trip. That was when things started to get worse. Around midnight again, the growl came back, closer this time. The wind had died down and the snow was falling heavier, blanketing the ground in thick, soft flakes. The air had a chill that bit deep into your skin, and I noticed the others were more on edge now. We tried to talk over the growl, but it was impossible to ignore. It was low, almost rhythmic, like it was circling us. That's when we heard the first scream. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a sharp, sudden gasp. Then there was a struggle, a rustle of leaves, and another scream, this one full of terror. We all rushed out of the tent, half-dressed and shivering in the snow, trying to make sense of what was happening. One of the guys was gone. Just gone. No trace of him except a patch of disturbed snow near the trees and some fresh claw marks leading off into the woods. We tried to follow the trail, but the snow was thick and the wind had picked up again, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The growl came again, close now, vibrating through the ground, as if it were right beneath us. My heart pounded and all I wanted to do was run, but we couldn't leave him out there. Then we heard it, a rustling in the trees, something moving quickly, silently coming toward us. I turned to run, but the growl was closer than I'd ever imagined, and it sounded so close to my ear, like it was right behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running. I don't know how long we ran through the forest. I lost track of time, the snow falling heavier and the trees seeming to close in on us. But then there was another scream, louder this time, piercing through the air. The scream of someone else taken, dragged into the darkness. We stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, our bodies freezing. The snow was deeper now, and the silence that had fallen over the forest was heavier than it should have been. Then I saw it, something massive, moving slowly between the trees. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was tall, hunched over with huge claws that scraped against the bark of the trees and eyes that glowed faintly red in the darkness. The bells jingled, faint but clear in the stillness of the forest, as if whatever it was enjoying the hunt. I froze. I had no idea what to do, no idea how to escape. All I knew was that whatever was out there, it wasn't something we could fight. It wasn't even something we could outrun. The bells got louder, closer, and then there was another growl. This time, it wasn't the creature we'd been running from. It was something else, something just behind me. The snow had started falling heavily just as I passed the last service station. A flurry that quickly turned into a full-blown blizzard. I cursed under my breath for not stopping. My windscreen wipers thrashed back and forth, struggling to keep the view clear, but all I could see was white. When my car spluttered and came to a halt, the fuel gauge tauntingly empty, I realized I had no choice but to seek help. The road stretched desolate in both directions, shrouded in snow and silence. My mobile had no signal, of course. I pulled on my coat, grabbed my torch and stepped out into the biting wind, hoping to find shelter nearby. That's when I saw him, or rather, the red silhouette against the whiteout. A man dressed as Santa Claus waved at me from across the road. He was bundled in a tattered red suit, the white trim matted and dirty, but the smile on his face seemed genuine enough. He pointed towards a cabin barely visible through the trees, beckoning me to follow. Reluctantly, I trudged after him, the snow crunching underfoot. The cabin was small and crooked, like something out of an old Christmas card gone wrong. Inside it was stiflingly warm, the smell of wood smoke mingling with something sharper, something metallic. The man gestured for me to sit by the fire, and I didn't argue. My fingers tingled painfully as they thawed, and for a moment I was grateful. He handed me a steaming mug of something that smelled vaguely like cocoa, then disappeared into the back of the cabin. I sipped cautiously, my eyes darting around the room. The decor was a bizarre mix of festive cheer and neglect. Fairy lights draped across sagging shelves, stockings hung over a cracked mantelpiece, and a tree in the corner, its needles brown and brittle. The sense of unease crept in slowly, like the cold seeping back through my damp socks. As I warmed up, I noticed sounds beneath the crackling fire, muffled noises, faint and irregular. At first I thought it was the wind howling through the trees, but it wasn't. It was too rhythmic, almost human. My stomach tightened. The man returned, his smile unchanged, and gestured towards a cot by the wall as if inviting me to rest. I nodded, pretending to agree, but stayed seated. He lingered for a moment, then retreated again, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. The noises grew louder as the minutes dragged on. I stood trying to seem casual and wandered towards the kitchen, hoping to find a phone or some way to contact help. Instead, I found a door at the end of the hallway, partially hidden by a hanging coat. It was bolted from the outside. The sounds, now unmistakably voices, came from behind it. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the door, pleading whispers and muffled sobs. My breath hitched and I stumbled back, the floor creaking beneath me. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall. He was watching me. His smile had vanished. I mumbled something about needing air and shuffled back towards the main room. The front door was shut tight, the key nowhere to be seen. Panic set in, sharp and suffocating. I couldn't stay. The fire crackled louder than before, as if mocking me, and I realized he was still there, standing by the tree. His eyes followed me, unblinking. My hands trembled as I picked up my coat, feigning calm. But I knew he wouldn't let me leave, not willingly. The mug I'd been drinking from still sat on the table. I grabbed it and hurled it towards the window. The glass shattered and the cold rushed in. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I scrambled through the jagged opening, the shards cutting into my palms, and ran into the storm. The snow swallowed everything, the trees, the road, even my own footprints as I fled. Behind me, I heard his voice, shouting my name, growing closer. The cabin lights dimmed until they were swallowed entirely by the blizzard. I didn't dare stop. I don't know how far I ran before I saw headlights cutting through the storm. I stumbled into the road, waving frantically. The car stopped and a figure stepped out. Relief flooded me until I saw the red suit. The last thing I saw was the grin, wide and toothy, as he reached out. I first heard about the Silent Santa from my son Liam. He came downstairs one December morning, his cheeks flushed, and I told me Santa had been in his room during the night. At first I thought he was dreaming or maybe mixing up some Christmas cartoon he'd seen. Kids have wild imaginations, especially this time of year. But then he mentioned something odd. Santa didn't say anything, not even a ho ho ho. Just stood there by the window, watching. It wasn't just Liam. A week later I overheard a conversation at the school gates. A couple of mums were joking about how their kids had been saying the same thing. A Santa that didn't talk, just stared. One said her son claimed he'd left a peppermint on the windowsill. She laughed it off, but there was an edge to her voice, like the story had wormed its way under her skin. I didn't think much of it until Liam found a candy cane under his bed. He swore he hadn't put it there, and neither had I. My stomach twisted a little, but I brushed it off. That night, as I tucked Liam in, he asked if Santa would visit again. His tone wasn't excited, more curious, like he didn't quite know how to feel about it. I told him Santa only came on Christmas Eve, thinking that would put his mind at ease. It didn't put mine at ease, though. There was something about the way he kept glancing at the window, like he expected to see someone there. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m, I got up for a glass of water. The landing was dark, but as I passed Liam's door, I froze. It was open just a crack, and I could see a shadow moving inside. Not Liam's, it was too tall, too still. My heart hammered as I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Liam was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in the soft glow of his nightlight, but the window was unlocked. I was sure I'd latched it before bed. The next day I mentioned the stories to my neighbor Carol. She told me about the old legend, the one I'd somehow never heard before despite living here most of my life. Decades ago, there was a man who worked as a mall Santa in town. He was mute, she said, and the kids loved him. But one year he had an accident during the Christmas parade, fell from the sleigh and broke his neck. They said he died instantly. But then she lowered her voice and said there were always rumors he'd survived, that he lived somewhere in the woods outside of town. I laughed it off, even as a chill crept up my spine. That night I locked every door and window in the house. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Around midnight I woke to a noise, a soft shuffling like fabric brushing against wood. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. Liam's door was ajar again. My throat tightened as I peered inside. He was there, a man in a red suit, standing perfectly still at the foot of Liam's bed. His face was pale and slack, the white beard hanging crookedly from his chin. He turned his head toward me, slow and deliberate, and I saw his eyes. They were glassy, vacant, as though he wasn't entirely alive or entirely dead. My breath hitched, and in that instant Liam stirred. The man snapped his gaze back to the bed, but he didn't move. He just stood there, silent and unblinking. I don't know how long I stood frozen in the doorway. Minutes, seconds. When I finally stepped into the room, the man was gone. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I called the police. They searched the house, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been there. They suggested I install a security system and left it at that. A week later, on Christmas Eve, I found another candy cane on the windowsill. This time there was a note tucked beneath it. It wasn't written in ink, but scrawled in something dark and brown, the letters shaky and uneven. It simply said, "Not naughty." I don't know what he does with the ones who are. I was only passing through when I saw the advert taped to the window of a newsagent's. "Santa for hire," it said in bold red letters with a phone number scribbled below. It wasn't like I had anywhere else to be, and I knew I could fit the role. The beard was real, thick and white as fresh snow, and the red suit I'd found in a charity shop added just enough polish to make me convincing. People trusted a man in a Santa suit. They didn't look too closely. The first house was a semi on the edge of a housing estate. The parents had booked me for their Christmas party. A few dozen kids hopped up on sugar, adults nursing drinks in the corner, music thudding just loud enough to rattle the cheap decorations on the tree. I settled into my role easily, bellowing my ho-ho-hos and handing out plastic trinkets from a sack I'd slung over my shoulder. The children clambered onto my lap one by one, their faces glowing with excitement. But it wasn't the children I was watching. The father was loud, brash, He didn't bother lowering his voice when he spoke to the mother, barking commands at her like she was hired help. His hand shot out more than once, grabbing her arm when she didn't move quickly enough. She flinched every time, her eyes darting to the floor. I noticed the way the children avoided him too, their laughter quieter when he came near. I knew the type, I'd seen it before. When the party wound down, I made my excuses and left, but I didn't go far. I stayed in the shadows outside, watching through the frosted windows as the guests trickled out. By the time the house went dark, I'd already decided what I would do. The next morning, the police found the father in the back garden, his body twisted at an odd angle in the snow. They said he must have slipped coming down the icy steps, cracked his head on the stone path. A tragic accident. I didn't plan to stay in town, but the calls kept coming. Word had spread about the real Santa, and parents were eager to book me for their parties. Each house was the same, children laughing, adults mingling, but there were always cracks beneath the surface. A mother who drank too much, her words sharp as knives when she thought no one was listening. A father who kept his hand on his son's shoulder just a little too tightly, his smile thin and full of warning. It was easy to pick them out, the ones who hid their ugliness behind Christmas cheer. The accidents piled up. A mother drowned in her own bathtub after a night of heavy drinking. A father fell from the roof while stringing lights. The newspapers started calling it the curse of Christmas, a dark cloud hanging over the festive season. But the townsfolk didn't seem to connect the dots. Not yet. It was the sixth house where things began to unravel. The mother had hired me for a private party, just her and her 2 children. She greeted me at the door with a wide smile, her breath smelling of spiced rum. The little boy tugged at my sleeve, eager to show me the model train set he'd gotten early that year. The girl, older and quieter, hung back, her eyes darting to her mother with every movement. When the mother knocked over her drink, she exploded, shouting at the girl to clean it up. The girl obeyed quickly, her hands trembling as she sopped up the spill. It was the same story I'd seen a dozen times before, but this time I hesitated. The girl caught my eye for just a moment, her expression blank and unreadable. She knew, I realized, she knew what I'd been doing. I left the house that night with a strange unease twisting in my gut. I couldn't shake the image of her face, the way her eyes had narrowed just slightly when she looked at me. It was almost calculating. The next morning, the mother was dead. The papers reported it as another accident, but I knew better. The girl had learned from me, copied my methods right down to the smallest detail. For the first time, I felt something close to fear. A week later, I woke to find a note slipped under the door of the dingy flat I'd rented. It was written in neat, childish handwriting. "Thank you, Santa," it said. Beneath the words was a list of names, other families, other towns. It was my turn to feel like prey. Oh, I should have known something was wrong from the moment I made the call. I'd been in a mood for weeks, furious about the way people had been treating me. Clients, employees, even family. They all seemed to think they could walk over me without consequence. So, when I heard about the man who could make your worst enemies fear for their lives, I didn't hesitate. He called himself a Krampus impersonator. But I didn't care about the details. The man had a reputation for terrifying people into submission, and that was exactly what I needed. I'd arranged for him to show up at a private gathering I'd been hosting. Nothing too fancy, just a few of the people I wanted to intimidate. I didn't expect much, just a man in a costume making a bit of noise, scaring them a little. Maybe they'd think twice before crossing me again. The night came, and the room was filled with laughter and polite conversation, the sort of thing I could have done without. The air was thick with alcohol and insincerity. Then the lights flickered. At first I thought it was just a glitch, a power surge. But then I saw the shadows move. It came from the corner of the room, tall and dark. I could see nothing but its outline at first, a hulking figure, massive and twisted with long, grotesque limbs. The sound of hooves on the wooden floor echoed through the room, louder than any man in costume should have made. It stood still for a moment, like it was taking in the scene, and then the bells started. I'd expected a man with a bell or two to rattle them for effect, but this sound was deep and unsettling, like it was coming from somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. The guests, who had been laughing and chatting just moments before, fell silent. I saw a few of them shift uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting around, searching for an explanation. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. It was imposing enough without words. Its eyes gleamed a faint red in the dim light, and the way it moved, too smooth, too slow, like it was testing the limits of its own strength, kept everyone frozen in place. The man I'd hired, the so-called Krampus impersonator, was nowhere to be seen. I thought maybe he was hiding in the back, letting his creation do all the work. But then I saw the first signs something was wrong. The creature's head jerked to one side, its eyes locking onto one of my guests. A woman, seated with her glass of wine still in her hand, looked at the thing and froze. I couldn't see her face, but I could tell from the way her body tensed that she was terrified. That wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was just meant to be a show, a bit of theatrics. The creature reached down, its clawed hand extending toward her, the sharp, bony fingers curling as if it was toying with her. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, my breath visible in the air. It was as though the warmth of the room had been sucked out entirely. Everyone was standing now, some of them moving toward the exit, but no one dared to make a sound. No one dared to run. I knew then. I knew that something wasn't right. The way the thing moved, the way it seemed to the fear in the room, it wasn't part of the plan. The man I'd hired didn't have this kind of power. He was just a man in a suit. This was something else. The creature, if it was even still an actor, turned its head toward me, its red eyes locking onto mine. It took a step forward, and with that movement the room seemed to grow colder. The jingle of its bells echoed louder than ever before, like they were ringing directly in my ears. I was frozen, paralyzed by a cold that sunk into my bones. I tried to move, tried to call out, but my voice failed me. The thing's gaze never wavered as it stepped closer, its hooves scraping against the floor with each step. The guests behind me were backing away, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't make my legs move. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know if it was here for me or for the others. It didn't matter. I realized too late that I'd made a terrible mistake. The figure raised its hand, its claws hovering above my head. I thought I was going to collapse right there. But then it stopped. It lowered its arm slowly, its eyes scanning the room, as if deciding which of us would be next. I don't know how long we stood there. I lost track of time, too scared to look around or move. My heart was hammering in my chest, but it felt like the creature was waiting for something. Something more than fear. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the thing turned away. It moved to the door, its heavy hooves echoing through the silence of the room. The bells rang one last time, a sharp, shrill sound that seemed to linger in the air like a warning. When it was gone, I didn't know what to do. The room was still, the guests staring at each other, wide-eyed and speechless. I never saw the Krampus impersonator again. No one spoke about it, not even in hushed tones. It was as if it had never happened at all, but I knew it had. And I knew that whatever I had summoned, whatever I had paid for, was no mere man in a costume. I'm still waiting for it to come back. It was all so easy. The house was one of those neat little detached ones, with fairy lights strung across the gutters and a wreath on the door. I could tell they'd put effort into making it feel festive. The kind of place where people believed in traditions, kept up appearances. The kind of place where a little girl would still leave out cookies for Santa. The window by the side of the living room wasn't locked. It never was in these sorts of houses. People got comfortable in their routines, trusting the safety of their tidy streets. I slid it open just enough to squeeze through, landing quietly on the thick carpet. The scent of pine from the real tree hit me first, mixed with the warm aroma of cinnamon candles burning low on the mantelpiece. It was like walking into a Christmas card. The plate of cookies sat on the coffee table next to a glass of milk. Homemade by the looks of them, the frosting slightly uneven, sprinkles scattered haphazardly. A child's handiwork. My breath caught slightly at the sight of it. She had written a note too, in scrawling, blocky letters on bright red paper. I didn't bother reading it. It wasn't meant for me anyway. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the tree lights. They blinked lazily, washing the walls in shifting colors that made the shadows dance. It felt too quiet, even for the middle of the night. I stood still for a moment, listening for the creak of floorboards or the hum of a heater. Nothing. Just the distant ticking of a clock. I reached for the cookies, more out of habit than hunger. Something about the act felt right, like it completed the image. The crumbs stuck to my fingers as I crouched by the tree, scanning the room. A small stack of presents sat neatly arranged, wrapped in cheerful paper with glittering bows. I ran my hand over one, the coarse texture of the wrapping paper prickling against my skin. I imagined her excitement, tearing through it in the morning, oblivious to the fact that I had been here first. A sound broke through the stillness, a soft rustle like fabric shifting. My head snapped up. At the top of the stairs, just visible through the doorway, she stood, small, pale in the dim light, her hair sticking out in sleep-tangled tufts. She was staring right at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The blinking tree lights cast her face in a rotating array of colors, red, then green, then blue. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, not yet. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A stranger in her home, dressed in red, crumbs on his fingers. I rose slowly, careful not to startle her. She backed away, one step, then another, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I followed, my boots soft on the carpet, but heavy enough to make the floor groan under my weight. The house seemed to close in around me as I ascended, the shadows on the walls growing longer and darker. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The air was different here, heavier, colder. She wasn't in the hallway. She'd slipped into one of the rooms, the door left slightly ajar. I moved towards it, my pulse thudding in my ears. The room was small and filled with the trappings of childhood, a dollhouse, stuffed animals, posters on the walls. The bed was empty. I felt it before I saw it, the shift of air behind me, the faintest scuff of movement. I spun around just as something sharp caught my leg. I stumbled, catching myself against the bedpost. She had a pair of scissors, small and dull, but enough to make me hiss in pain. She stood in the doorway, holding them out like a sword, her tiny hands trembling but steady enough to prove she wasn't bluffing. I took a step forward and she bolted. She was fast, ducking under my arm and sprinting down the hallway. The house was suddenly alive with noise, the slam of a door, the rattle of a lock. I followed, limping slightly, the cut on my leg throbbing with each step. She had locked herself in the bathroom. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Her breathing was quick, panicked. I knocked lightly, the sound echoing in the small space. No response. I waited, the seconds stretching into minutes. The weight of the silence pressing down on me. Then, faintly, I heard it, the creak of a window being opened. By the time I got downstairs, the back door was wide open. The cold air rushed in, carrying with it the faint sound of footsteps on the frosted grass. I stepped outside, the icy wind biting at my face, and scanned the yard. The garden was empty, the street beyond silent and still. But somewhere, out in the dark, I knew she was there.